Hey, Fearless Leader Toki, do you got a minute?
Yes, Lolly?
I was just wondering, does any of this make you nervous, like at all?
What do you mean?
Well, what about Ubosatha for one? You saw that scary flying guy, he looked like a big meanie, and he was just a servant. We're gonna have to fight some eldritch god at some point.
I see. It seems as though your peaceful existence has cost you your strength, Lolly. The victory of an idyllic life has left you defeated already. What?
Nothing. I guess what really makes me nervous is that we have to go underground, to the deep dark. I don't like it down there. Not enough green.
That's because the shadows betray you, little rogue. Because they belong to me.
Wait, what did you say?
You think the darkness is your ally just because you are a rogue? But you merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't even see the light until I was already a man, Lolly. That is why I fear no fear from what's below.
Well, wait a minute, I've heard that before.
No, you haven't.
Yes, I have.
No, it just came to me just now.
No, it didn't.
Yes, it did.
Well, whatever, Mr. Spooky Darkness fella. Thanks for the pep talk. Now I think I'm really ready for anything.
Well, hello there. Welcome to the Dungeon of Zen. Before we get started with today's video, I want to say thank you and welcome to all my new and returning viewers. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you stick around for all the videos to come. It's going to be a journey as we go through my session journal, but I think it'll be worthwhile to everyone watching. And again, I really appreciate everything that you do on my behalf. It's great. Thank you. Now, let's get started with the video so that we can keep this nice and snappy, nice and succinct. I want to keep these videos to be about 20 to 30 minutes, so there's no point in wasting any time. In today's video, we will go over the session recap from the last session so that you can all be up to speed with where the players are at in their journey. I'll go over the remaining random encounters I have prepared for them along the way, and if there's time, I'll go over the way in which I deal these random encounters to the players at the table. And I use that word deal rather purposefully because, as you can tell, there are playing cards involved. And mine are particularly cool from Runehammer Games. I'll show these when we get to the journal, and I'll show you how I use them at the table. So let's get started with the recap. My players began the session knowing exactly where they wanted to go for the first time in maybe forever. They'd been left with a number of options for how they wanted to continue the story. So eventually they finally chose that they wanted to go to Venenosa to research the growing threat of Ubosatha, gather allies, and hopefully put young Krieger Schulz back on the throne and retain his aid on their quest to deal with Ubosatha. However, like my vignette at the start of my last video revealed, my players had totally forgotten to collect Krieger prior to their departure. I mean, it's a classic player oversight, right? To forget to actually articulate the action that you'd like to do to fulfill the desired goal. In this case, bring Krieger with us. But instead of reminding them outright of their mistake, I had them figured out on their own with a little bit of prodding. And when they realized their mistake, they decided to go back to town, incur the risk of rolling an additional 2 encounters, and retrieve him. Luckily, for them, they managed to avoid any further entanglements and found him hanging out with Fenn's family happily. So they proceeded to gather him up, stuff him in a box, and throw him in the back of their carriage for safekeeping as they journeyed to Venenosa. At least this time they, managed to give him some air holes and a place to do his business, because, that could have been an awkward reveal down the road. In any case, they finally began their journey in earnest at this point. So I had them roll for 1 encounter per day for the 4-day journey to their first destination along the way, Landshut. Encounters at this stage of the journey were meant to be not that easy to come by. All they had to do was roll a 12 on a d12 to trigger one. And sure enough, the player who controls Lolly rolled a 12 on his very first roll. And the look on their downtrodden faces as they realized this was going to be a long journey and some of them might not actually survive the trip is a core memory that I will cherish for probably my whole life. Of course, luckily for them, they pulled the Lonely Obelisk roleplay encounter, so no big deal, I guess. And it ended up being quite the boon for them, as both Unzar and the NPC Pina learned a new language, Undercommon, which I assume will be very useful to them as they head down to the Underdark pretty soon. At least I hope they'll go down there. Fenn also learned a new language, Primordial, which in the moment we decided sounded just like the Sardaukar throat chanting from Denis Villeneuve's first Dune movie. Fun, and he loves it. He's going around doing it to everybody he can find, and of course no one can speak it, but he still enjoys doing it. And of course, they staved off any form of long-term madness during their attempt at learning this new language. How lucky for them. So I'll go over the mechanics of this encounter later as we go to the journal. The next day, however, they rolled something far more interesting, the A Fate Worse Than Death encounter. Again, more on the mechanics later, but the reason why I included this encounter to the party is because they'd already encountered Vargulis before, in Kelgar Keep. Ricard, our halfling bard, was actually infected with the curse and would have had his head torn from his shoulders and turned into one of these creatures himself had it not been for the intervention of Thodaris Baldark, one of the NPCs I mentioned in my recap video. She was able to actually channel some of her own power into Ricard, exterminating the curse, but sacrificing some of herself in the process. Narratively, she appeared to age considerably, but mechanically, she lost a few dozen hit points, which is a pretty noble sacrifice. She absconded to the Deep Dark on her own adventure to continue her own story path, but the encounter really rattled Ricard, as did the sacrifice. So, returning to the encounter itself, the party heard a commotion coming from a small cottage off in the distance. Fen and Lolly snuck up as player characters often do to investigate, and both rolled quite well on their acrobatics and stealth checks to peek inside and notice young children huddled in a dark corner, but they were obscured by darkness. Lolly, also having failed a perception check, didn't notice the Vargulis in the rafters, so when she went to help the children, initiative was triggered and the Vargulis earned a surprise round. But as usual, luck was on her side, as it often is, as she pirouetted out of the way to avoid any damage because, the Vargulis just missed all their surprise attacks. And the players had, of course, prepared for such an inevitability and had readied actions to cast spears, javelins, tridents, shoot arrows, magic missiles, everything but the kitchen sink as soon as some bad guys arrived. As such, the encounter ended up being rather trivial, but that's okay, because the real heart of the encounter comes from the children themselves, as the party quickly realized were in fact infected with the Varguli curse and were slowly turning. Their ears were elongated, their tongues slipped from their mouths occasionally when they tried to speak, and their necks seemed a little bit longer than normal. But based on knowledge gained from Thodaris back in the keep, as well as a little testing in the moment, they learned that they could slow the progression of the curse with the resources they had, but they had no idea just how long it would take before the children succumbed to the inevitable. So, in classic D&D fashion, the players spent nearly an hour discussing the moral implications of just what to do with these children. They went back and forth, some players or characters wanting to invest a lot of time and energy into curing these children, derailing the entire campaign completely to go find a cure, while others thought it might be better just to do something about it sooner rather than later. So with the help of a few die rolls to help settle the debate, Lolly decided to take the children out back behind the barn, cheer them up with good thoughts, and help them recall happy memories before quietly and efficiently, well, you get the picture. Now, it might seem trite or slightly sadistic to put forth a moral conundrum that could result in what actually ended up happening in front of my players, like I did, but I didn't do it for a laugh, and I didn't do it to be edgy, nor to make them feel bad. I did it because the encounter works, because it helps them develop through meaningful action and real-time decision-making just who their characters are. It's so easy to write up a backstory in a vacuum where choices can be thought over and changed on a whim, but moral decisions with no easy, simple, or obvious outcome can really flesh out a character's backstory, personality, and motivations. And what's more, the players get to see it all unfold in real time. All of my players now have a better understanding of not just themselves, but each other, because they got to experience actual choice. Also, most of us have real children in real life, so yeah, you can make of that what you will. Anyways, when the dust settled, the characters gave the children a proper burial and were appropriately respectful. But then they returned to the road, because the road is the only true constant in an adventuring party's life. Thankfully, the last few nights went by without any incidents, and the next morning they arrived in Landshut. Now, the remaining encounters and situations in this recap were outlined in my last session prep video, so if you'd like a little bit more context as to the mechanics, go ahead and check it out at the link wherever I can put it up here. And it all seems so idyllic and peaceful at first, until they got a little bit closer and were able to notice the smoke billowing from the town itself, and the frightened wails of saddened people wafting from behind the walls as well. Arriving, they noted the broken palisade and burning buildings, and as the encounter outline indicated, they also found Marshal Matreus trying to stymie a posse from forming and going out to likely get themselves killed, as these NPC parties often do when they try to be heroes. At his behest, the players agreed to eliminate the creatures, but they weren't able to get much of a description from the townsfolk. because the populace had been too in awe of what they had been seeing that night to really truly describe these monsters in any meaningful way. It had been dark, and they'd been too monstrous, too gargantuan, too eldritch to really find the right words. Pretty foreboding. But before they went off to dispatch the creatures, they quickly found Sheethauser, who annoyed the hell out of them as he was sitting there eating a nice little steak while the whole building was collapsed around him and people lay dead in the streets everywhere. Perfect. But they still agreed to take on his little side quest to find the Stone of Balor and meet up with him in Venenosa. And finally, at the suggestion of Toki, whose player always finds creative solutions to rather unique problems, like when he formed the Children's Liberation Army in our Curse of Strahd campaign to assault Castle Ravenloft at the end. That was surely unique. In his continued uniqueness, he went around looking for anything that could be caught on fire. Hemp, tar, pitch, the like, anything that could be flammable. I wonder what he's going to use all that for. The journey to follow the creatures went without incident. It was easy to follow their path through the woods, but they still found Thornburt Rose strung up in a web, one of the NPCs from the town. And this webbing was the first real indication that these creatures were some kind of spiders. As they continued, I described the webs becoming more and more ubiquitous and widespread, covering almost every inch of the forest floor and the trees and bushes around it. It made it very difficult to avoid, although they did a pretty good job, and they didn't touch Thornburt Rose, which was important. Now, I want to make a quick note here that while in my last video I suggested that this encounter was very much inspired by DM Scotty and the movie Aliens, I also recently read a book called Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is about sentient spiders that evolved on another planet to become its dominant species. And the book does an awesome job describing how large swaths of the world are covered in webs, and that the spiders use these webs as a kind of long-term or long-form communication platform to communicate with each other. That's a really cool visual, and while the party didn't really interact with the mechanic very much because they were smart enough to avoid the webs and not touch Thornburt Rose, having read that book really helped build the whole scene in my mind and heavily encountered the construction of not only the encounter, but how I described it. So I guess if I have any piece of advice, any piece of universal advice that I can give to you all without hesitation, it's just go read, like a lot. And go check out the YouTube channel Quinn's Ideas, who gave me the inspiration to read this book. I love this channel. It's great, so go check them out. Now, not too much later, they finally found their way to the nest, and as they were preparing to well, hello there. Welcome back to the Dungeon of Zen. Again, it's me from the future. I guess you could probably tell due to the hair and the backlight back there, which I think is a little bit better this time. I guess we'll find out when I edit it. Speaking of editing, the reason why I'm filming this segment is because while I was editing the video, I realized that my former past self must have suffered some kind of mini stroke while filming, and I don't mean to make light of a pretty serious medical condition, but he was rambling, stumbling over his words, more so than normal, and he was going on a diatribe that even I didn't understand, so I thought it was only best to re-record this footage. Also, my DSLR camera, which is about 13 years old, decided to cut off filming after about 20 minutes, I guess some sort of auto timer feature that only triggered because it's an old camera. I'd only lost about 15 seconds of footage, but combined with how I was acting in the end there, I figured it was best just to re-record all this stuff. So where were we? Ah yes, I believe we were about to reconnoiter the spider nest, at least the party were about to. And as they were setting up to spy the nest and see what was going on, I described this Jurassic Park-like moment where there are these low vibrations that suddenly got louder and louder and louder until crashing through the tree line came the monstrosities and revealed to the party was just what they were going to be facing. And I described them as being mostly spider on the bottom, a little bit of spider on top, but they also had these gangly human-like arms. I described the whole thing kind of like Shin Godzilla. Most of them were familiar, but for the few that weren't, when they Googled it, they sure were startled, as I'm sure you are as well. But luckily for them, the spider creatures didn't stay very long as they descended into the nest to take with them the game that they had hunted for consumption. It gave the party time to plan, and plan did they. Oh my gosh. They put together this cockamamie classic D&D scheme to take Toki's napalm bomb that he created back at the village and float it out over the nest, and using Unzar's familiar Fester to light it on fire and drop it on the nest, blowing it up. And they were able to do this through some pretty great dice rolls, and the creatures were severely damaged due to their creativity, and that's great. They should be rewarded for their creativity. But, it did severely mitigate the effectiveness of the combat encounter, but like with the Varguli attack, it's okay, because the real meat of this encounter didn't really come from combat. That wasn't the priority here. The priority and the real heart of this particular encounter is what was to come in the nest itself. And as the party slowly descended into the tunnels, creeping their way through this narrow orifice to reach the cavern itself, I described this gargantuan, web-filled cavern with cracks and fissures all along the walls. I described mutilated animals all over the floor and the villagers strung up by webs from the ceiling. They also found a sea of unopened cocoons, and in the far back corner, slowly breathing, was this spider queen the size of a house, with a birthing canal attached to her rear. And that is where we left the session off. Now, I like to leave sessions before a big encounter or sometimes after a big encounter. It all depends on the flow. So this is just what felt natural at the time. It was getting a little late. I think normally I would have had them fight the Spider Queen, but like I said, it was getting late, so it was best to start it off fresh the next time around. So I guess we'll find out what happens. I'm sure they'll go in there, guns blazing, defeat the Spider Queen, completely mitigate all the prep that I've done, and free the villagers and move on. Or they'll die, and I'll truly cherish that moment. But if they don't, I guess we should take a look at the journal and see what else I have prepared for them as they hopefully continue their journey to Vindanosa. Let's go take a look. All right, welcome back to the good old journal. Here we are at session 10. Title of this particular session is the Landshut Vindanosa. Real generic, I know. We've got Photos, Unzar, Ricard, Fen, and Lolly. Toki couldn't make it. It's okay. He's a busy guy. It happens. Lolly is our food person, and Lolly likes to order Chinese food, so I'm very excited. Let's go through the session outline really quick. We'll do the diagram. We'll go through our lists and our running the session, and then we will go into the random encounters themselves. All right, the session outline. Remember, the session outline is just what I think is going to happen, not necessarily what will happen. It's just my best guess. So we're going to wrap up the Landshut quests, which include Sheethauser, the Spider's Lair, and then the Citizen's Flea, which I have actually a note of over here. It's not a full encounter. It's just something I added at the last, not the last minute, but before the session as something that just kind of came to my mind. There's the Overland Journey to Matricia, which will take 16 days. There's Hill King's Rest, which I have recorded originally as a random encounter, but I have actually put so much effort into developing it as a lore dump in a way. Not a lore dump, but a location to learn about lore, that if they don't roll for it randomly, I'm going to give it to them purposefully. And then they will arrive in Matricia. Onto the diagram, which I love just recording here in my session outline page because it is such a great visual representation of what I prepared. And as you can see, I've got quite a bit. They're going to start out in the Spider's Lair, make their way to Landshut, maybe go back and talk to Sheethauser if he's still around, we'll find out. And then we'll go to encounters. They might even skip Landshut entirely and go straight to encounters, which is why I have this line here. And then there's the encounters that I've prepared: Hill King's Rest, Derelict Ship, Goblin Ambush, Goblin Base, and then they could all lead back to Hill King's Rest. So what this diagram indicates is that the encounters could lead them directly to Hill King's Rest, or they might go to these other ones and then end up here before heading to Matricia. So that's how this diagram works. All right, our quests are the Spider Assault, meeting with Sheethauser, Hill King's Rest, and arrival in Matricia. This little circled number is just the page number for where this encounter first appeared in the journal. So it was first on page 2 in my session 9 outline page. I just have it there as just a quick little visual reminder of like where this thing originated in case I have to go back and reference something. So here's my quests. These are the main things they're going to do. And then here are the encounters. We got Goblin Ambush, Goblin Base, Derelict Ship, Hill King's Rest. Locations to prepare: Matricia and Landshut. The VTT needs include an encounter I have to build in Fancy Grounds called Arrival in Matricia, and then some art for Matricia as well. I've got my little terrain and NPC kits just for my general knowledge of what I need when I go to the table. I haven't quite developed how I'm going to showcase this in videos quite yet, which is why I haven't done a terrain video, but I'm still working on that. Things to come. All right, running session 10. This is the most important thing I have ever done in my session prep, is just to quickly lay out how to run the session. What is the key pertinent detail I need to start, continue, and then maybe even end a session? And in this case, I have reminded myself that as soon as they reach level 5, or they will reach level 5 upon their next long rest. They will reach level 5 at the Spider's Lair, but I'm not going to have them actually level until they do a long rest. I don't like the idea of leveling just in the moment. I think they need a long rest at least to refurbish themselves a little bit and get that XP going. When they return to town, I would like to reiterate Matreus' decision to lead 200 Landshutians to Vindanosa. So this is something that happened in my session itself, where Matreus did mention that they might be leaving, and then the players were going to decide whether or not to bring them along with them. So I'm going to have Matreus reiterate his desire to go and to request the players escort them. And then I have my Landshut Matricia 16 days note again. And here is my overland encounter cheat sheet. One player will roll a d10 and I'll subtract 1 to determine days traveled before an encounter roll. So if they roll a 10 at day 9, they roll for an encounter. They roll a d12 on an 11 or 12, they get an encounter. So it's quite possible that they go straight to Matricia without any encounters at all, in which case I will run the Hill King's Rest on the evening before arrival in Matricia as a quest. So it's totally possible that they'll only ever get this one encounter, but that's okay because it's a good one. However, it's possible that they might roll quite a few encounters along the way, and if they do, they'll get a lot of experience, they'll get a lot of knowledge. As I said before, there's a lot of narrative reasons for all my encounters, so it isn't as though it'll be just a waste of time. And then I have a quick note for a +1 shield for AC, just to build it out in Fantasy Grounds. I should have put it over here, just because that will be a quest reward for this Rescue Dwarves encounter that I forgot to mention earlier. That's in Matricia. We'll get to that some other time. Okay, so let's go to our encounters and see what we have awaiting the party. All right, I've already discussed this section in my last video, so we will move on to the Goblin Ambush encounter. Now, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I actually want to present this material to you, the audience. All of this makes sense to me, and it's important that I have this written down for my own peace of mind. Some of you may look at it and think it's too much, it's too little. Some might not understand why certain things are here and why certain things are in Fantasy Grounds, for example, instead of here as well. All kinds of questions, and I understand that. I want to reiterate that this journal is not meant to be a one-size-fits-all approach to preparing. This is my approach. You guys can take from it what you'd like, ignore what you don't like, but then use it as some food for thought as you develop your own sessions. So again, I'm not going to go through every little thing line by line and kind of waste our time, but I'll go over the big things, and I'll always cover the narrative objectives. I think that's the most important thing that I want to kind of showcase here is why these encounters are here, why I chose them, why I built them, and how I think they will aid the journey for my players as they go to Venenosa, not just how they get there and the things they find along the way, but how they learn about each other, if that makes sense. All right, I can already tell as I'm preparing this video that I'm probably not going to get to my random encounter generator. I just don't think we're going to have time. But I do want to showcase a little bit about the cards that I use in relation to the DC that I have here. So what I do is for most encounters is I have a set static DC, and as I explained in my first video, I sometimes will call for an easy check or a hard check, and then that would just mean that we reduce this number by 3 or increase it by 3. So either a 9 or a 15, 15 being hard, 9 being easy, 12 being normal. And to remind my players, I like to lay out these cards that I've gotten from Runehammer Games. So I'll put a 12 or a 10 or a 15 or an 18 or whatever on my DM screen so they know what the base number is. And then these cards here are timer cards. So sometimes if there is some sort of looming threat that's going to happen, I will roll a d4, and that's the number of rounds before something happens. And I will put these cards out there as well to remind players of just how many rounds they have left. This is not my system at all. This is from Hanker Infernal's Runehammer Games. I'll leave a link to his Icy Card RPG system in the description. It's a great system. I don't use a lot from it, but I use this because I think it's great. I think this is honestly what most people probably use from it because it works so well. And it's worth noting that I don't use this static DC for absolutely everything. You'll notice throughout the journal that there are moments where I have other DCs, but it is just a great way to just have a DC set. You kind of think about it ahead of time and establish it, and it makes life a little bit easier. And the players like knowing what to shoot for ahead of time. And it also kind of takes away some of the guesswork on my end and maybe also convinces them that I'm not cheating behind the screen, which I think is always something that's always in the back of their mind. My players are mature and they don't think that I'm trying to kill them all the time or ruin their fun, but I still like to be as open as possible without necessarily rolling all my rolls in front of the GM screen. All right, let's get to the encounter. All right, so all of my encounters have a narrative objective. I've talked about this before. Every encounter should tie into the narrative in some way to make the encounter interesting, engaging, provide a meaningful reason to interact with the encounter. If there's no reasonable or meaningful reason to interact with it, what are the players really getting out of it? Unless your players really just love killing monsters and rolling dice without any kind of long-form repercussions, go for it. Roll those. That's great. My players like narrative. They like story. They like lore. And I don't want to just throw a combat encounter at them without there being something that they can get out of it. And I don't just mean loot. Loot isn't always enough. In this case, with the Goblin objective, or the Goblin ambush, The narrative objective here is that Fen has a relationship with goblins. He spent a lot of time with them as a youth, and he knows of all of the various tribes in the area. He knows in particular that the Blood Moon Pack are a bunch of degenerates who will sacrifice anybody and anything, for any reason, and they're going to do so at a coming blood moon. And he knows one of these guys in particular, Barry, because they spend time together. And even though Fen is actually known to this tribe, they're still going to sacrifice him because that's how much they care about their sacrifices and appealing to the blood moon. However, Barry will try to help them. So we're going to give them an opportunity to learn more about goblins. Fen is going to get an opportunity to recruit Barry, and I have an NPC recruitment system in my game. Pina is Unzar's companion, and Dench is Toki's. So this will give a chance for Fen to get Barry. And all my goblins all have names like Barry and Larry and Terry and Jerry and Carrie. I don't know why. It just kind of came to me spontaneously in the moment all those years ago with my very first campaign. And they also all sound like Rose from the Golden Girls. She's from St. Olaf and she's very nice in Minnesota. Nice, all that. They sound like this. I don't know why. It's just something that happened the very first time we played, and it has stuck ever since. And it's just one of those little through lines in all my campaigns, no matter what world we're playing in. So that's the objective. It's a fun objective, and it's also a chance for them to learn a little bit about the Blight, because there is an encounter inside the Goblin base, if they get this far, where they'll meet a guy named Hans Gruber of Die Hard fame, and he is studying the Blight, and they can learn something from him. All right, so again, this isn't really going to be a presentation on running combats, the rules. This is just preparation. So I'm not really going to talk much about the enemy types, the enemy tactics, all that. Now, I do want to talk about this encounter start really quick because it's a kind of a neat little way of doing it. And this is how the encounter will actually get kicked off once the encounter itself is rolled. I'll have all the players roll a perception check, and if all of them succeed somehow, they will in fact turn the tables on the goblins and ambush them. I kind of messed this part up here, but if more than 50% of them succeed, 4 to 5, the goblins will have disadvantage on the first attack, although there will still be a surprise round. If half of them succeed in the perception check, they will avoid the surprise round entirely. And if only 0 to 2 of them, or so if they all fail, 1 or 2 succeed, then the goblins will actually get advantage on the first attack and a surprise round. So it's just kind of a cascading way to punish or reward dice rolls. And I think the players will like this. We'll see how it goes. And then if there's any loot here, there'll be standard weaponry of lesser quality than normal. No mechanical changes, just crappy in appearance. So if the players succeed and win this fight, then they just move on, which is fine. If they lose this encounter, they're not going to die. I'm going to have the goblins knock them out, tie them up, and haul them back to their base for another chance at survival. It's kind of nice because it doesn't just result in a straight out TPK. It gives them another chance with more narrative hooks to continue playing their characters. If 1 or 2 of them die along the way, oh well, that's what it is, but this will avoid the TPK at the very least. So the synopsis is that the Blood Moon Pack is scheduled to have a sacrifice in the coming days. They've been killing and securing some prisoners to sacrifice for the Blood Moon, and Barry, Fen's friend, is here, and he will try to help Fen escape. So again, the narrative objectives: recruit Barry as an ally, possibly recruit the goblins as allies. So there is certainly a chance that Queen Lady will actually hear out the players and ally herself with them in the coming fight against whoever. There's also a chance to learn about the Blight from Hans Gruber. And then there's also a little bit of a Easter egg here with the Dark Elves. There are some artifacts in here that the players can find that indicates that the goblins are interacting with the Loth Royale, or the Drow, who in my world are very subterranean. They don't ever come above ground. This whole situation going on with Ubosatla is the only time in which, in recent history, where they've come above ground at all. So this kind of ties the surface dwellers to the Underdark people and kind of indicates what's going on below ground. The encounters start, the players will awaken without gear or clothes. They'll be entirely naked, and I don't do this for a joke. I don't do it for a jest. I do it to expose their vulnerability. They are completely exposed. They've got nothing. Only the spellcasters will be even remotely useful in this stage of the game, but even they will be at a disadvantage. Barry will come and attempt to communicate with Fen. He'll kind of leave some secret notes to him in some food. And then this flow of battle is basically the dungeon crawl here. So as they move from room to room, and I've got my little map here with my little area designations, they start in A, the prison. As they move from room to room, I have them roll a collective stealth check. I don't have it trigger on individual failures, but they accumulate failures. So after the first 6 failures, so say all of them fail their first stealth check, then immediately an encounter is triggered. And again, they got to get the DC 15 here. If they move from A to B and only half fail, I make a note that there's 3 failures, and then they go from B to E, if 3 more failures, then the encounter happens. And the encounter is just some minions and a couple goblins and an underboss goblin as well. Speaking of which, these names of the goblins, brutes, minions, snipers, the goblin queen over here, I've got spellcaster, I've got snipers, and then I've got underboss over here. These are all from Matthew Colville's Flea Mortals book, which is fantastic. I like it. Use it or don't, doesn't matter to me. All right, I'm not going to go through all this because it's far, far too much. But these are the room descriptions for each and every location. I have the prison, kitchen, gear room, sleeping quarters, the lab, throne room, temple, and the loot room. And the loot room is actually where all their gear actually is. I should write that down here. PC's gear. So they got to go all the way from A to H to get their gear. Long way. Again, this is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to scare them. This is their last ditch effort to survive. So I'll go through the first couple here. You can read the rest, but every one of these rooms has a descriptor because that's all I need to really set the scene in my mind. Cramped, dirty, locked cages, old bones, smell of decay, 2 exits. With that in the moment, I could develop a scene description without needing to read box text and have it sound wooden. The NPCs, Barry, Goblin Guard, and Saul Pinky, that's a bandit who was captured. His comrade is sitting in the kitchen about ready to be cooked alive. So here's my encounter. I got Barry to feed Fen information about guard rotations, notes in the food. He says basically to wait for the 3rd guard who's sleepy. And Pinky will also explain how her bandit partner was captured and taken away yesterday. Wants help escaping and saving friend. Just adds another layer to the encounter. So again, I'm not going to keep going, but I do have this part here about checks. So at this point, if there are no fails, so if they have not yet gotten their first 6 fails resulting in an encounter, any checks made in this room are easy. If they've created one encounter, it's a regular check. And then if they have had more than one encounter, it's a hard check. Anything in here. Plus the day and the night cycle also matters. And there's some loot here. And this changes a little bit as they go on further from their starting point. It's kind of arbitrarily decided, but I used my good sense to figure it out. So here Hans Gruber will kind of give them some information if they talk to him. He'll tell them about a secret exit in C. He can talk a little bit about the Blight. In the throne room, the queen will negotiate. She'll go for an alliance. I even have a little encounter in here about a lawyerly dispute between goblins. I think this is a fun little thing just to showcase of what is happening during the day. At nighttime, everyone's clearly sleeping. And then over down here in the temple, there's even a war spider that can be launched should they reach 3 rounds of combat. So you can read through this if you'd like. This is an escape the goblin based scenario. They're going to be without gear. They can pick up some cheap gear over here. See in the loot room. I'm sorry, in the gear room. They won't find anything good there, but at least they can clothe themselves, give them some crappy armor and some crappy weaponry, and that will help them. But if they don't come this way, if they go up this way, then they might be in trouble. So I'm really curious to see how this plays out. Okay, moving on. Again, talking about narrative. Along the way, they might roll the derelict ship encounter. And basically, this is a character encounter meant for Toki, our half-orc former sailor, former dog of war, former mercenary who has seen the world and has a lot of baggage because he's made not only a few friends, but plenty of enemies along the way. They will encounter a ship that will be one that Toki had served on, and within the hold of the ship is a note for Toki, and I have a handout for it. I'll show it here if I can find it. I should be able to find it. Shouldn't be too hard. And it's basically a hook for him to encounter a former colleague and get up to some hijinks. It'll also tie into the hunt for the Stone of Bolor mini quests that I have set up for Venenosa, which is very much modeled on Waterdeep Dragon Heist. We'll see how that goes. But this whole encounter is just for Toki, basically. The enemy type, it will kind of reveal the guy in the back, who's that snaky creature that was flying around back in the day that took out half the players, although they survived. So this is a nice way to reintroduce him, and it reveals how the guy in the back goes around actually turning these creatures into the Blight. So they learn a little bit about the Blight. They learn that it's not just a naturally occurring thing, but there's a creature the guy in the back who goes around infecting things, causing it to spread. I also have a history check here. This one will come up quite often. So basically what I've created here is a check chart. I've determined these DCs to let the players know what they know about this scenario, and it's outside of this static DC up here. If they ask, what do I know about this ship, that's very, very specific. I don't want to be constrained by one single roll. I want to be able to give them a little bit of extra breathing room to know a little, a bit, a lot, or everything. And that's where these numbers come from. If they roll under a 9, they know nothing, right? If they roll between a 9 and a 15, they have partial knowledge. Yeah, I've seen ships like this before. They're boats, they float on water. This one is definitely for some sort of mercenary company. If they roll a 21, between a 15 and a 21, they have some general knowledge about this place. They might recognize the sigils or the symbols on the boat. Then all knowledge, Toki automatically gets this because he served on this boat. But if they roll at least 25, they know all about this boat. They're very familiar with it. They've actually seen this particular boat perhaps. They know who served on it, etc. All right, let's move on to Hill King's Rest. This started out as a simple encounter, but as I thought about it more and developed it over time, I decided to turn this into a quest, where when they get here, they can learn a lot about Ubo-Sathla and the world that existed prior to their world. Because as you may remember, this world is built upon the previous civilizations that came before. Ubo-Sathla has often rose up and wiped out prior civilizations, and then the next one that come along builds upon it. It's kind of like the Reapers from Mass Effect, if you're familiar with that. And in this case, obviously, things are coming to a head. This is the Shepherd timeline, if you will. But in Hill King's Rest, they will be able to learn that there was a pair of rulers, a king and a queen, who were able to come together, develop technology to fight Ubo-Sathla, but then they were betrayed by this great betrayer who stole one of the swords that they were using to hurt Ubo-Sathla, and they were punished for it and taken over, and Ubo-Sathla was not defeated. So that's what they can encounter here. So I will go into a little bit more detail on this one. There's one Deathlock White as an enemy. This is the main bad guy, the Great Betrayer. And then there are two gargoyles, although they're reskinned gargoyles. They're mostly just paintings that will come off the wall to attack the party. The encounter starts by Photos and Unzar hearing whispers on the wind. Photos' patron and Unzar's dead friends will kind of urge them to come down here. They'll find a campsite that's been used recently with a door ajar indicating that somebody had come down here recently, although they will simply find the bodies dead in the atrium here. And once they get down here, we'll get to the anteroom. And again, you guys can go through this a little more thoroughly on your own, but there are murals in each and every one of these rooms, and these murals is art that I have had generated that showcase the lore from the past. The first one just shows a king and a queen holding out these powerful swords. The second one in the ladies' room showcases how the queen crafted these swords and gave them to the king. The third one will show the great betrayer offering one of these swords to Ubo-Sathla's harbinger, the same guy they found back in Sulzbach. And then the last one will actually show a great mural the size of an entire wall that reveals Ubo-Sathla in all of his glory. So that should be fun. I'll show them the art and they'll hopefully be like, whoa, that's cool. Now everybody loves a little encounter building, so let's go through it really quick. The players will start in A, and their end destination is clearly D, but they've got to visit B and C first in order to get to D. They have to pull these levers, which are located in or near these rooms. B and C are meant to be traps. If they touch any of the items in either room, a gargoyle will spawn, and that's just the stat block that I've used, but it's basically a giant mechanism that will come out of the wall painting, the mural in the anteroom, and attack the players. If they trigger the lady, then the king gargoyle will emerge. If they trigger the great betrayer, then the lady will emerge. Kind of a fun little detail. Once they pull the levers, they'll have access to the room, and they'll find the loot being one of the swords, and the king will kind of choke out a response saying that the players need the other sword. It's in the deep dark. He's got no idea where, but if he can find the other sword and combine it with the sword that he has, it'll become a great, powerful device that can fight Ubo-Sathla. And I have some sad Romeo and Juliet stuff here where the king is in his chair and he's wizened, he's falling apart. He's basically a living zombie, a conscious zombie, and he can move around the chamber, but he can't leave. Whereas his wife, the queen, is completely immaculate, completely perfect, looks as beautiful as she did before she was placed in the chair. But she is fully conscious of everything, but cannot move, cannot make a sound, cannot even move her eyes or blink to look at her lost love, the king. Pretty tragic. I actually don't know how I'll resolve this at some point. Maybe when Ubo-Sathla is defeated, they can come back here and they'll both be dead or something. I don't know. We'll figure that out way down the road. So this is a fun encounter. They'll learn a lot. They'll maybe die. We'll see. It's always the goal. Now, if you watch the first 10 minutes of the video, you know that the players actually triggered this Varghulli attack, so I don't really need to describe it too much. But basically, this Varghulli attack was designed to give them some sort of moral conundrum to deal with, and boy, did they deal with it. They fought the Varghullis, they defeated them rather easily, but then they had to deal with the poor children and their transformation and what to do with them. And it turns out that they just decided to, well, I'm not even going to say it on YouTube, but you guys all know what happened. So I'm not really going to go into this one too much. The narrative objective was to allow the PCs to learn that the growing threat of Ubosatha is affecting more than just their small, regional, localized area of the world. The children will tell them that Venenosa, the city that the players are heading to, is actually being overrun by refugees seeking shelter from all over the realm, all over the area. It will reveal to the players that this threat is much more global than they might have thought before. Also, if they rescue these children somehow, which they didn't, of course, they could have used them to help get into good favorites with one of the guard captains. Sadly, that is now lost to them, but that's okay. All right, the last encounter of the day, the Lonely Obelisk. Like I mentioned, this is a narrative role-play encounter. Not even really a role-play encounter, but just a narrative one. They'll find this mechanism in the woods that can basically imbibe the player character with a new language should they stave off an intelligence check. And a few of my players were able to actually get a great boon from this. Fen learned Primordial, Unzar and Pina both learned Undercommon, which will serve them well in the Deep Dark. This is the way I had it all charted out for them as they touched the obelisk. Here's that history check again that I talked about. They have no knowledge if they roll anything below a 15. Between that and an 18, they'll have some partial knowledge. Maybe they've seen or heard of one of these before, but they have no idea what it does. General knowledge will indicate that maybe they have heard some rumors about what it possibly could do. They know that it's some sort of learning tool for languages. And if they roll a 24 or higher, they know what it does. They've seen it. Other people have used it that they know about. They have knowledge to actually truly understand what it is they're looking at. I do up here have a little part here where there's an easy intelligence check to know that these are languages. When they look at the actual obelisk and see all the writing, a 15 will allow them to recognize this stuff as languages. If they have a spell, obviously no check is required. So back to the intelligence check itself, they roll a DC 20, they have to get an 18 to save, and that's really high, right? An 18 is really high, and both Unzar and Pina and then Fen later, even Dench learned their new languages. They all rolled over 18, and I was super mad, but that's how it goes. So anyways, I have more notes for myself. If they use the obelisk again within 72 hours, the DC is increased by 3 per use. The max amount of language they can learn is 3, or else they'll have some brain overload. If they fail one of their rolls, I will have them roll on the long-term madness chart. And if they actually roll lower than a 5 on this check, if they roll a 13 or lower, I'm actually going to lower their intelligence score by 1. And if they roll by less than 10, so if they roll an 8 or under, I'm lowering their intelligence score by 2. There needs to be consequences in this world. People can't be going up to random magical items and just expecting good things to happen every single time. There has to be something bad that can go wrong. So this is going to really teach them a lesson. But, of course, it didn't, because they all rolled so freaking well on their saves, and they all learned languages, and none of them had any problems along the way. How lucky for them. All right, that's my session 2 prep session. I think I'm falling into a little bit of a rhythm. I need to work on my articulation a little bit. I will fully acknowledge that, but I hope you guys learned something. I hope you appreciated the video. Please let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions or words of encouragement. I will certainly take those as well. So until next time, have a good one.